Okay, so my name is Zach Golding, and the educational giant that I am going to be talking about is Thomas Aquinas. And he was born in the year 1225 in Italy. And an interesting story about him. So before he was born, his mother, it just said she was talking with a religious hermit, and he actually prophesied the birth of Thomas and said that she would have a son who would be a monk and who would be extremely important to their community. And so after he was born, he was enrolled at a very young age of 5 to attend a local school, or university as they called it, and he was to teach, to learn philosophy and theology. And as he studied in this school, he learned lots of things, and he had influence and was influenced by many different people. And one of them was one of his teachers, who introduced him to a group, a religious group called the Order of the Dominicans. And this was a group that he grew to love and that he wanted to join. And it was difficult for him, excuse me, because his family didn't want him to join this group. And it was in Rome, which was quite a ways away from where he was living. And so he knew it was the right thing to do, so eventually he ran away from home. He was 18 years old, and he decided that it was the right thing for him to do, so he left, and his family found out about it. And actually, on his way to join this group, his parents and his brothers, and they caught him, and they took him back home, and more or less they imprisoned him at his own house. And it's a really interesting story because it just shows how dedicated he was to his beliefs and how much he believed in following the right things and following what he believed to be truth. And so for 2 years he was stuck at his house, but he continued teaching people. His family really wanted him to stay, but they weren't able to get him to. He eventually escaped, and the way I understood it is they allowed him to escape so that it looked like he'd escaped, so they could preserve their own dignity, but he was allowed to leave. And Thomas began his career as a monk and continued teaching and studying. And one of the people that he studied a lot was Aristotle. And one of Aristotle's beliefs, as we read in the book, was realism. And he believed that you had to come to know truth through rational thoughts and through inquiry and more or less scientific method. And something interesting about Thomas Aquinas is that he believed in those philosophies and he studied them, but he was also very interested and studied a lot of theology, and he was surrounded by the Catholic Church, and and he kind of meshed those two philosophies together of theology and realism. And it's actually interesting that in our book, one of the 3 philosophies that are mentioned is Neo-Thomism, which was adopted from the teachings of Thomas Aquinas, and so his teaching had a strong effect on the world, and especially on religion. In fact, in the Roman Catholic Church today, when they teach the priesthood seminary classes and they're training people to become bishops or cardinals or whatever it may be, they still follow the teachings and the guidelines of education that were established by Thomas Aquinas. And I wanted to share a story real quick about my educational experience. So I'm a biology major here at BYU Idaho, and I've studied a lot of science, and one of the classes we're required to take as a biology major is evolution. And it's really interesting to take that at a religious school because many times the topic of evolution can be divisive, to say the least, in a religious setting. And I didn't know it at the time, but looking back now, many of the philosophies that my professor used were philosophies that were established by Thomas, and the ideas that we could arrive to know that God exists through rational thoughts, and that we could kind of combine those 2 ideas of religion and realism, and we didn't have to choose one or the other. We could mesh them together. And in many ways, from what I understand and what I learned, that's kind of the defining qualities of his philosophy are those of combining science and religion. And it had a huge effect on the world, really, because today, especially at Brigham Young University, Idaho, that's one of the major things they teach in a lot of the foundation science classes, is that we can be religious and we can also use science and the scientific method to understand truth. And the important thing that Thomas focused on is that all truth comes from God, and all truth is truth, which is exactly how I feel. And throughout his life, he was extremely dedicated. That story was one example, but there were more examples where his family tried to get him to turn away from his beliefs or what he wanted to do, but he stuck with it, and eventually came to be known as one of the great philosophers of our time. And I think his impact is huge, not only on religion, but also on science and on philosophy in general. And that's all I have, so thank you.